Hey, and welcome to another Brexit Explained video. In today's episode, we're going to talk about Scottish independence. And that's sort of Brexit related. So if you only follow us for our Brexit related content, keep watching. But it's also sort of not Brexit. So if you're completely bored of Brexit, then you can also keep watching. At TLDR News, we value independent, unbiased reporting, and it's what we strive to provide. I'm about to quit my full-time job for TLDR, so if you want to support the channel and think the kind of news we create is important, then consider backing us on Patreon. I explain the whole situation, our goals of what we'll do with the money, and what you get from supporting us in another video. Find that and a link to donate in the description. Anyway, so Scottish independence. If you live in the UK, you'll probably know what we're talking about. It's the raison d'etre of the Scottish National Party, and there was a referendum held on the topic as recently as 2014. However, if you're not from the UK, here are the basics to catch you up. The UK is one single sovereign state, which includes England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, as well as a whole load of smaller islands. Scotland became part of the UK way back in 1707, but for reasons we're not going to go into in this video, Scotland has toyed with the idea of leaving the UK in the past to become an independent country. The movement really picked up steam in the 1970s, when oil was discovered in the North Sea, off the east coast of Scotland. The Scottish National Party, on a bit of a high from winning the 1967 Hamilton by-election to secure their first ever parliamentary seat, started a campaign called It's Scotland's Oil. They argued that an independent Scotland could nationalise the oil industry and use the revenue to reinvigorate the Scottish economy. The campaign was insanely successful and turned the SNP into a political powerhouse in Scotland. The party succeeded in turning the argument for Scottish independence from an abstract political argument about sovereignty into a more real, pragmatic, economic approach. And to be fair, it does make a lot of sense. In fact, in 1974, the Conservatives commissioned a report called the Macron Report, written by leading government economist Gavin Macron. The report concluded that thanks to great national infrastructure and oil reserves, an independent Scotland would actually have one of the strongest currencies in Europe. This report scared the two main parties so much that it ended up being kept a secret until 2005, when the SNP uncovered it via a Freedom of Information request. Anyway, having gained 5% of the vote and won 0 seats in the 1966 general election, the SNP went on to win 7 seats in the February 1974 election, and then 11 seats in the October 1974 election, with over 30% of the vote in Scotland. Political circumstance fell in their favour as well, with James Callaghan's minority Labour government offering them a referendum on Scottish devolution in return for support in Parliament. The referendum, which ended up happening in 1979, asked the Scottish electorate if they supported a devolved assembly for Scotland. 52% of voters said yes, they did, but the overall turnout was actually only 64%. This meant that only 33% of the total electorate voted for a devolved assembly, and the referendum had included a provision that a positive result required at least 40% of the total electorate. This obviously annoyed the SNP. Despite having won the referendum, in inverted commas, they'd been beaten by a technicality. In protest, they withdrew their support for the incumbent Labour government, leading to the 1979 general election, which didn't go particularly well for them. They only won 2 seats, with about 17% of the Scottish vote share. Now is probably a good time to distinguish between devolution and independence. Devolution, which is what the 1979 referendum was about, describes the process of legislative decentralisation. Basically, instead of all legislation happening from Westminster, a new assembly would have been created for Scotland, which would have been able to legislate over certain Scottish matters. However, devolved assemblies aren't actually sovereign. Ultimately, the Parliament in Westminster is still sovereign, and it just lends its sovereignty to the devolved assemblies. This means that Westminster law overrides Scottish law, and Parliament can actually just dissolve any devolved assembly it wants to. This is why a devolved assembly effectively borrows its sovereignty from Parliament. It only has power because Parliament decides it does. By contrast, an independent Scotland would be a sovereign state, with sovereignty independent of the UK's Parliament. The SNP wanted a devolved assembly because they saw it as a stepping stone to a fully independent Scotland. Anyway, back to the history lesson. Despite doing badly in the 1979 election, the SNP persevered, constantly making the case for an independent Scotland. This led to the Claim of Right in 1989, which declared the sovereignty of the Scottish people. It was signed by all Scottish MPs, except Tam Dalyell, a Labour MP who was stridently opposed to independence. 1997 comes round, and in order to win over Scottish voters, Labour leader Tony Blair promises a referendum on devolution if his party are victorious. John Major, the Conservatives leader and campaigning against Blair at the time, actually told the public that they had 72 hours to save the Union. That argument clearly didn't quite land, as Blair's Labour Party won the election by a landslide, and as Blair had promised, there was another referendum held in 1997. The referendum asked two separate questions. 1. Do you agree that there should be a Scottish Parliament as proposed by the government? To which 74.3% of Scots said yes. 2. Do you agree that the Scottish Parliament should have tax-raising powers as proposed by the government? A statement which 63.4% of the electorate agreed with, and the total turnout was 60.2%. So now the plan had the approval of the Scottish people. It led to the creation of the Scottish Assembly, with some limited tax-varying powers, a body known as Holyrood. Holyrood is made up of 129 members of the Scottish Parliament, or MSPs. Holyrood's powers have substantially increased since then, mainly thanks to the Scotland Acts of 2012 and 2016, and it now has almost complete control over taxation, as well as an independent social policy. Anyway, the creation of a devolved Scottish Assembly actually seemed to increase appetite for an independent Scotland. And after the SNP won a majority in the Scottish Parliament in 2011 with 69 seats and a commitment to an independence referendum in their manifesto, the UK Parliament agreed to a referendum. In 2014, the independence referendum actually happened. The question read, should Scotland be an independent country? And notably, the franchise was extended to 16 and 17-year-olds in the referendum, in accordance with the SNP's policy of reducing voting age for all elections in Scotland. The SNP weren't the only party engaged with this vote though. All of the major UK parties weighed in to try and galvanise support for their side. On the side of remaining united and Scotland staying in the Union was the Better Together campaign. This campaign, run by Alistair Darling, was supported by the three major Westminster parties, the Conservative Party, the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. On the other side was the Yes Scotland campaign, who, as the name suggests, were in favour of Scottish independence. They were supported by the Scottish National Party and the Scottish Green Party. When it came to voting day, the turnout was actually phenomenally high, at 84.6%, but the majority of them voted against independence, with 55% of voters voting no. Most politicians probably thought this was the end of the issue, at least for a while, but Brexit has dredged it back up again. Scotland is particularly Europhilic. 62% of Scots voted to remain back in 2016. And as the rest of the UK pushes for a harder and harder Brexit, Scotland is, on the whole, reluctantly being dragged along. Polling done by Datapol in September 2018 showed a 4% lead for Scottish independence if the UK leaves the EU. And the most recent YouGov polling, done in April this year, had it neck and neck, with 49% of Scots in favour of independence. This is a pretty substantial swing from the same YouGov polling conducted in 2018. Which had support for Scottish independence at 45%. According to YouGov, this increasing support is because Scottish Remainers are increasingly looking at independence as a way to stay in the EU and avoid the possibility of a no-deal Brexit. To add to this momentum, the SNP has a meteoric 20+ points lead in the polls, with the Labour vote being split between the Lib Dems and the Greens, and the Conservatives leaking votes to the Brexit Party. The major parties' issues really allow the SNP to capitalise and grow even more than ever. Never one to miss an opportunity, the leader of the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon, made this exact point in April, describing independence as a way of avoiding the worst damage Brexit will do. Brexit fundamentally shifts the debate around Scottish independence. There are a whole load of reasons why Scots may want to be independent, but clearly the opportunity to rejoin the EU after gaining independence is another one to add to the list. In fact, Sturgeon seems to be placing it front and centre, saying that independence is not my starting point for these discussions, My starting point is to protect our relationship with the EU. This isn't an entirely new argument either. The EU was discussed during the original independence referendum. Back during the 2014 referendum campaign, the UK was still in the EU and wasn't set to leave anytime soon. That meant that if Scotland left the UK then, they would have lost their EU membership and would have had to go through the whole process of reapplication. With Europe so important to many Scots, leaving the EU and then having to reapply from scratch was too much for many voters. In 2019, the UK is set to leave the EU, so Scotland is going to lose its membership regardless. If they choose to leave the UK now, they will lose their membership, but as an independent Scotland, they will be able to reapply as a separate entity. If they stay in the UK, they'll lose their membership when the UK gets round to leaving, and as part of the UK, they won't have the power or ability to reapply. There are a whole load of other arguments for independence that we could cover in another video. Like this video and comment below if you want that. But Brexit fundamentally changes the equation. No longer is Scotland throwing away its EU membership by leaving the UK, now it's being given the opportunity to rejoin, something it doesn't have as part of the UK. However, Brexit cuts both ways for the SNP. In 2014, if the Scots had decided to go their own way, it would have been relatively simple. They would have had to change their currency, for sure, which isn't easy. But then again, it isn't impossible. However, in these pre-Brexit times, once Scotland had been allowed back into the EU, it would have joined the rest of the UK in the European Union. This would have meant that there would be no need for a permanent land border between the two countries. They would have both been in the single market, so would have had the same regulations, been in the same customs union, had the same tariffs, and would have both been members of the common travel area. So there's no need for immigration checks either. But say if the UK, and more specifically England, leaves the EU single market and customs union, then there's going to have to be some kind of checks between an independent Scotland and England, assuming that Scotland wants to stay in the EU. Nicola Sturgeon is particularly keen for a second referendum, and polling suggests that a good portion of the electorate are too. The question is if there's enough support to actually make it happen. Polling does seem to show that there's a slightly increased number of Scots supporting independence, but it's not been a massive swing. Though, admittedly, the core arguments of the campaign haven't been made yet. When it comes down to it, we don't know for sure whether a referendum will ever come to pass. But looking at the polling results, if it does happen, it could be a very close race. As I explained in one of our videos, I'm about to leave my full-time job to focus on TLDR news. As such, we need your support more than ever. We have big plans, including introducing podcasts, new series, getting a studio, and employing team members. But that all becomes possible with your help. You can find out more about our plans and about how you can get involved by checking out our full video on the topic. You can also head over to Patreon to learn all of the benefits of signing up, including gaining access to our behind the scenes podcast, early access to videos, live streams with the TLDR team, exclusive merch, and much more. Find links to all of that in the description. If you can't support us financially, then you can always subscribe to us on YouTube to see our videos when they're released. You can also find us across social media simply by searching for TLDR News.